I'm a 36-year-old woman with two siblings, my brother Damon, who is 34, and my sister Nancy, who is 28. From as early as I can remember, Nancy was always the favored child in our mother's eyes, a status she's maintained throughout her life. Our father, though he sometimes tried to rein her in with a word or two, granted her far more freedom than Damon or I ever received. Meanwhile, Mom consistently allowed Nancy to get away with almost anything. In our family, Mom affectionately described Nancy as a surprise, since she arrived much later than Damon and me. I truly believe that the age gap played a significant role in the extra attention and leniency Nancy was granted ever since she learned to walk and talk. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when or how the differential treatment began, but it was unmistakable. Nancy always received more attention, had a larger presence, and was showered with constant praise. Even when she misbehaved, there were no real consequences. Mom would simply laugh it off as if her antics were the most endearing thing in the world. Growing up in the shadow of a cherished sibling was a painful experience. I constantly felt diminished and inadequate, as though I were always coming in second or even third in my case. Over time, I began to believe that no matter how hard I tried, I could never measure up to someone else's excellence. What hurt the most was Mom's unwillingness to recognize the obvious bias. Whenever Nancy unleashed a cutting remark, she certainly had a talent for it. Mom dismissed our hurt feelings, insisting we were just being overly sensitive or that Nancy was joking. But it was never a joke. You could see it in the small, self-satisfied smirk in Nancy's eyes, as if she took pleasure in making us feel insignificant. I still remember a moment from when I was around 12. I had just gotten some new clothes that I was really excited about, but the minute Nancy saw them, she blurted out that they made me look even whiter than usual. Mom just laughed and said, "Oh, Nancy, don't be silly," while I felt my face burn with embarrassment. It became a consistent pattern in our home, almost as if our family was divided into two camps. Mom and Nancy on one side and Dad, Damon, and me constantly on the defensive. Even Dad wasn't a steady ally. He'd sometimes shift his loyalties, probably trying to keep the peace. Nancy's relentless barrage of criticism wasn't limited to our childhood mishaps. She targeted every aspect of our lives, our appearances, Damon's ambitions, our personal choices. Nothing was off limits. I recall one Thanksgiving when Damon was animatedly discussing his literature degree, his passion for reading, and his aspiration to write, only for Nancy to casually label him an unemployed burden right in front of the extended family. The sudden silence that followed was palpable. Dad muttered something about Nancy overstepping, but Mom simply smiled as if to say, "Let her be." After a particularly grueling week at work, I once confided in Nancy about how utterly exhausted I felt. Seizing the moment, she launched into a tirade about how haggard I looked, arguing that my long hours would never allow me to find a partner. I remember her exact words, they stung deeply. "You look like you haven't slept in days, and honestly, no guy wants a workaholic hag who appears to have aged a decade in just a couple of years." For weeks after that conversation, I fell into silence, unable to face her. And it wasn't just us at home. Her casual disrespect extended to friends, distant relatives, and even strangers. Aside from Mom, everyone was fair game. Damon and I naturally harbored a profound resentment. We despised Nancy's cruelty, but our anger toward Mom for enabling it ran even deeper. I even recall a heated debate with Damon in which I insisted that we resented Mom for her blind support of Nancy's behavior. It might sound harsh, but it was the raw truth. In retrospect, I suspect that Nancy's conventional beauty may have compounded her inability to manage her own insecurities. When someone you regard as attractive tells you that you're not, it plants seeds of doubt that are hard to shake. I began questioning my own looks and worth. With the benefit of hindsight and therapy, I now believe that Nancy's constant need to tear others down was a way of compensating for her own deep-seated self-doubt. Rather than pursuing a traditional career path, she flirted with freelance graphic design, more as a hobby than a serious profession, while relying heavily on our parents for both emotional and financial support. Damon and I managed to brush off her insults until we both turned 25. But everything shifted dramatically 8 years ago when our father passed away. He had been the one holding our fractured family together, despite his own flaws and his occasional tolerance of Nancy's behavior. He was the one who made intermittent efforts to smooth over conflicts and maintain some semblance of order. His death, however, shattered that fragile bond. After he was gone, Damon and I began to drift away from Mom and Nancy. At first it was gradual, fewer phone calls, fewer visits. We'd still see them at major family events, the occasional holiday, or perhaps at Christmas, but only when we felt like it. Eventually, it became an intentional choice. We deliberately started keeping our distance. I now refer to it as building a wall between us and them, a barrier that, truthfully, provided much-needed protection from Nancy's relentless verbal assaults and from witnessing Mom's enablership. Initially, even after Dad's illness and final departure, we made perfunctory attempts to maintain communication out of a sense of obligation. But every call and visit felt strained and uncomfortable, as if we were forcing ourselves into an interaction that only reminded us why we were pulling away. More often than not, Mom would say or do something that reinforced our decision, making lofty comments about Nancy's non-existent successes or subtly critiquing our choices. One Christmas dinner remains especially vivid in my memory. Mom spent the entire evening lauding Nancy's alleged creative talent by showing off some dreadful drawings she claimed Nancy had done for a prominent client, who, as it turned out, was nothing more than a distant cousin. Meanwhile, she completely overlooked Damon's recent promotion and my successful completion of a major work project. That night was a stark reminder of the dynamics we were desperate to escape. As time went on, our excuses to avoid contact with them grew more elaborate. We cited being swamped at work, having prior engagements, even minor illnesses, anything to steer clear of spending time with them. The emotional toll of these forced interactions far outweighed any sense of duty we felt. Damon and I silently agreed that keeping our distance was the healthiest option. It wasn't that we didn't want to see them after Dad died. It was simply about preserving our own mental and emotional well-being. Importantly, neither Mom nor Nancy made any genuine effort to bridge the gap. They didn't call repeatedly or beg us to visit. Our growing apart was mutual and unspoken. Financially, we were all stable enough that there was no practical need for frequent interactions. It was just easier to remain in our own orbits, and the silence was in many ways a relief. Then, a few years back, Damon suffered a serious accident that shattered his ankle. At that time, he was between jobs and pouring all his energy into launching an online magazine. With money tight and medical bills mounting, I, as the CFO of a successful company, stepped in to help cover his expenses. Initially, Damon had stubbornly refused, determined to handle it on his own, but I persisted. I couldn't bear the thought of him draining his savings just as his magazine was about to take off. I ended up covering everything: his medication, extensive physiotherapy, and even hiring a full-time nurse to assist with his recovery. To me, it was a no-brainer. It wasn't about the money but about supporting my brother, whom I truly cared about. It was an expression of sibling love that, unfortunately, inadvertently set a dangerous precedent for Nancy and Mom. Not long after that, Nancy called me with a request that left me utterly stunned. It was so brazen and bizarre that I initially assumed she was joking. She wanted to buy a penthouse apartment, a luxurious penthouse, and asked for my financial help. She defended her outrageous demand by complaining that she was embarrassed to still be living with Mom at 28, and since I had helped Damon, it was only fair that I do the same for her. Conveniently, she omitted the detail that she only had enough money for half of the penthouse's cost. My immediate reaction was a mixture of disbelief and seething anger. Our conversations had become rare, and when we did speak, they were usually interrupted by her relentless insults and hostility. Now, seemingly out of nowhere, she was demanding a substantial sum of money. It felt surreal, especially since our last genuine, meaningful conversation had been years ago when she was busy belittling my life choices, doubting my career, and making sarcastic remarks about my appearance. In an effort to understand her, I asked about her so-called career. She insisted that she was a freelance graphic designer, though in reality, it was more of a casual pastime than a legitimate profession. She had no formal education in the field, no degree, and her portfolio was virtually non-existent. She had once made a few posters for Dad's firm, but they were never put to use. She even claimed to have a roster of exclusive clients, although in truth, they were mostly family friends lured in by Mom's persistent encouragement. Clearly, this wasn't a career that would ever enable her to afford a penthouse. I gave her a firm refusal, explaining plainly that I was not going to finance her extravagant lifestyle. I even suggested, rather bluntly, that if she wanted such luxuries, she should consider finding a proper job. As expected, she reacted with fury. She accused me of showing favoritism toward Damon, screaming about how I had easily helped him with his medical expenses and insisting that, as the eldest sibling, I was responsible for supporting her too. She completely ignored the fact that Damon's situation was a genuine emergency, whereas her desire for luxury was entirely self-induced. I tried to remain calm, but my patience was running thin. I repeated my refusal, emphasizing that I was not a bankier to fund her unreasonable dreams. I was disgusted by her entitlement and her complete lack of self-awareness, as if she truly believed that she deserved a penthouse simply because I was her sister. The conversation soon spiraled into a full-blown argument, her voice rising to near hysterical levels. Finally, I said my final word, no, and ended the call. I couldn't bear another moment of her shrieking. She called back several times, but I ignored every single call. It became painfully clear that our relationship, or whatever semblance of one we once had, was entirely transactional for her. She only reached out when she needed something, with no regard for my feelings or the years of awkward silence between us. The whole ordeal was utterly exhausting. The drama didn't stop there. Shortly afterward, Mom called, and the conversation was even more aggravating. In a whining, passive-aggressive tone, she complained about how unfair I was being to Nancy and accused me of playing favorites. She insisted that I owed them something because of my upbringing, and then revealed that Nancy had even approached our uncle, Dad's brother, who now ran the family business, before coming to me. He had, quite appropriately, turned down her request. This revelation not only highlighted their desperation, but also made it painfully clear that I was their backup plan. For some background, I deliberately chose a career path outside of the family business. I wanted no part of it, and neither did Damon. Nancy, on the other hand, only pretended to be involved when it suited her. After Dad passed away, his brother took over the company, and Mom continued to live comfortably on Dad's shares, which were legally transferred to her as part of his will. Eventually, Mom admitted that our financial situation was more fragile than it appeared, largely because of Nancy's lavish spending. She claimed that by helping Nancy secure the penthouse, she would ease her own future burdens, essentially asking me to subsidize Nancy's lifestyle. Then came the classic guilt trip. Mom threatened that if I didn't comply with their request, she would cut off all contact. It was utterly ludicrous, especially considering how little we interacted to begin with. I calmly pointed out the absurdity of it all, reminding her that it wasn't my problem and that if Nancy truly wanted such luxuries, she could either find a real job or keep living with Mom until she was 35, whichever suited her. That remark was the final straw. All the pent-up anger I'd harbored for years exploded. I told her in no uncertain terms that she had no right to accuse me of favoritism when it was she who had done it all her life. I reminded her that Damon and I had long since accepted the reality of our broken family dynamic, and that I owed them nothing. After all, I had my own life, obligations, and dreams to pursue. In response, she launched into another tirade, accusing me of ingratitude and disrespect, and screamed that she never wanted to speak with me again. I couldn't help but let out a bitter chuckle because in truth, what difference would it have made? We hardly communicated anyway. I mentioned my upcoming wedding, making it clear that I didn't need her presence in my life, and then I hung up the phone. Without delay, I blocked both her and Nancy on every platform available. An important detail I hadn't mentioned earlier is that this distancing wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the culmination of years of accumulated hurt and resentment, a necessary step to safeguard my own mental and emotional well-being. I should mention that I'm engaged to a truly wonderful and supportive man named Andrew, who is 37. We've been together for nearly 5 years, and he has shown remarkable understanding of the complexities of my family situation. At first, I even thought about inviting Mom and Nancy to the wedding, more out of a sense of obligation and a wish to preserve some semblance of family harmony. But after that explosive phone call, that idea evaporated completely. In the days following the argument, things got even messier than I expected. When Mom couldn't reach me directly, she messaged Andrew on social media, dumping her skewed version of events on him. She expressed deep disappointment in my actions and declared that she would cut me off for good. Even though I knew I was in the right, a strange twinge of guilt crept in, a remnant of society's insistence that family always comes first, no matter how toxic the ties may be. Andrew initially struggled to grasp the full scope of the situation. Coming from a tightly knit, supportive family, he never imagined his own mother and sister could be so harsh. At first, he even pitted Mom and Nancy, seeing them as the aggrieved parties. It took him some time to understand the real damage caused by all this dysfunction, and during that period, a serious strain emerged between us. I found myself having to explain and rehash the entire history of our family dynamics, once again pouring my heart out to someone who still didn't quite get it. Thankfully, the encouragement from strangers on Reddit, who had read earlier parts of my story, helped me see that my feelings were valid. Their shared experiences and unwavering support reminded me that I wasn't overreacting. I had every right to protect myself from toxic behavior, even if it came from my own family. Damon echoed these sentiments, citing countless examples of Mom and Nancy's manipulative behavior, constant negativity, and total lack of empathy. He reassured me that my reactions were completely justified, having endured similar pain himself. The real turning point came when Damon sat down with Andrew and laid out everything from his perspective. He offered concrete examples and recounted the long history of our family's dysfunction, painting a vivid picture of the emotional toll it had taken on both of us. Hearing it straight from Damon made all the difference. Andrew's view shifted almost immediately. He finally recognized the situation for what it was, a toxic, extremely unhealthy dynamic from which I needed to escape. He even admitted that his own family, which had always been picture perfect, had blinded him to my reality. From then on, he became my staunchest supporter, completely backing my decision to cut ties with Mom and Nancy. Just when I thought the worst was behind us, things took another unexpected twist. My uncle, Dad's brother who now ran the family business, reached out to Damon and me with an urgent plea. In a voice that was equal parts anxious and frantic, he revealed that Mom was planning to transfer a substantial portion of her company shares to Nancy. And it wasn't just any shares. She intended to give Nancy voting rights, granting her enormous control over the company. He was quick to call it a disastrous idea. We all knew that Nancy was completely unqualified for business management. She had zero experience and only cared about satisfying her superficial whims. In his view, granting her such power would trigger endless debates, power struggles, and reckless decisions driven solely by her self-interest and Mom's blind favoritism. The gravity of the situation wasn't lost on Damon and me. We realized that the future of the company, and the livelihoods of many people, depended on its stability. Moreover, we felt a deep, lingering commitment to our father's legacy. We couldn't stand by and watch this potential calamity unfold, so we decided to confront Mom, despite our already strained relationship and the recent explosive incident. We also felt a responsibility toward our uncle, who had been incredibly kind and supportive after Dad's passing. We couldn't, in good conscience, let him face this crisis alone. We braced ourselves and went to see Mom, fully expecting Nancy to be there and complicate the discussion even further. Sure enough, Nancy was lurking behind Mom like a menacing shadow. We immediately launched into our objections, labeling the plan to grant Nancy voting rights as utterly ridiculous. At first, Mom responded with cold silence, ignoring us as if we didn't exist. Then she switched tactics, insisting that we had no right to interfere with her decisions. Predictably, Nancy began screaming, accusing us of envy and claiming that we'd never wanted to be part of the family business, as if we were trying to take over it. Her voice rose to a fever pitch, and her face twisted with anger. It was one of the most stressful and unpleasant scenes I've ever experienced. I did my best to reason with Mom, appealing to the logic and responsibility Dad had instilled in her. I reminded her that Dad had clearly stated he didn't want any of his children involved in the company's day-to-day operations, having entrusted his brother to manage things. I explained that I had deliberately chosen a different career path out of respect for his wishes, and I implored her to reconsider the far-reaching consequences of her decision, for the sake of the company, our uncle, and everyone whose livelihood depended on it. Throughout our conversation, Nancy continued her tirade, hurling accusations of envy, hatred, and interference. At one point, she even threatened to call the police on us, as if we were unwelcome intruders in our own mother's home. It was a shocking display of entitlement and anger. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mom's deliberate silence during some of Nancy's outbursts was meant to make me feel guilty, as if I were the one attacking her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mom quieted everyone down. In a cold, dismissive tone, she told us that our behavior had been extremely disrespectful and ordered us to leave. She promised to consider our arguments and inform our uncle of her decision. True to form, Nancy stood by her side. Damon and I left, having made our point as clearly and forcefully as we could, though we weren't sure if it would change anything. That night, I called Andrew to explain everything. I reassured him that, even if nothing changed, at least we had tried. Then, 2 agonizing weeks later, our uncle called again with fantastic news. After much deliberation, Mom had decided not to give Nancy voting rights in the company. Instead, she would transfer preferred shares to her, ensuring Nancy a steady income, but stripping her of any real control over the business. This was a huge relief. At least for now, Nancy's probable mismanagement wouldn't threaten the entire operation. More importantly, Damon and I continued our no-contact policy with Mom and Nancy. In a way, this was the ultimate victory. Although it was surreal to have to step into a situation that wasn't directly our problem, we felt morally compelled to act, to honor Dad's wishes and protect the company's future. I also want to address a key point. Contrary to some assumptions circulating online after my earlier posts, Dad never abandoned us. He left us assets separate from the company's shares. A detail I didn't emphasize before because it wasn't central to the dispute over Nancy's entitlement and Mom's enabling behavior. Yes, we inherited other things, and while Dad wasn't completely blind to Nancy's shortcomings, he had a soft spot for her more than he probably should have. I prefer to remember him in a positive light. The bottom line is that Damon and I were never financially dependent on Mom or Nancy. We built our own lives, careers, and futures. Now, months later, the no-contact order remains firmly in place, and life has taken on a peaceful rhythm. With my wedding just a week away and invitations already sent out, Mom and Nancy were naturally not on the guest list. Our remaining relatives have kept us informed about the situation. Apparently, Mom and Nancy are in full meltdown mode. They learned about the wedding from our uncle, who was of course invited, and have been trying desperately to sabotage the event. They've been contacting other family members, dissuading them from attending, spreading lies about me, and portraying themselves as the aggrieved victims. It's a pitiful, predictable, and entirely unsurprising example of their constant need for attention and their inability to let go. My relationship with Andrew couldn't be more different from the one I had growing up. He is loving, kind, supportive, and honest. He's shown me that family shouldn't come with conditions. And those harsh, cutting remarks Nancy used to hurl at me? They're nothing now. I am not the jobless, lonely, overworked person she predicted I'd become. I am happy, successful, and on the brink of marrying the love of my life. Even Damon is proving all his critics wrong, including those who doubted his passion for reading. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more real-life stories as they unfold.